It is really a great pleasure, I mean, indeed an honor to introduce our speaker tonight, Professor Suranjan Das. Professor Das is the current Vice Chancellor at Adamas University in the North 24 Parganas of West Bengal. He has served previously as the Vice Chancellor of both Yadavpur University and the University of Calcutta. Now, according to my reckoning, if he bags the Vice Chancellorship at Presidency University, where he did his first degree, he will have completed the grand slam of running all 4 of the elite institutions of higher education in the greater Calcutta region. So I wish you good luck in completing the career grand slam in due course. Now, of course, many of you in this room and online will know Professor Das from his seminal 1991 OUP book, Communal Riots in Bengal, 1905 to 1947. This reworking of his Oxford DPhil, I assume it was a reworking of your Oxford DPhil, examines the evolving patterns of socio-political rioting in Bengal during the first half of the 20th century, with a view to accounting for accounting for the specific communal formations of identity and rioting across communal, religious and communal lines that emerged at the eve of independence. Now, this text continues to appear on the syllabi of courses on modern South Asian studies at several UK institutions, including at Cambridge, where it's been followed ever since it was first introduced by you very soon after it was published. Now, Professor Das followed this success up with a further 24 single-authored, jointly authored, and edited volumes on Indian history and politics, especially identity politics, sociocultural change, nation building, and foreign policy. He's even delved into the history of medicine in one of his books. But I'd like to call your attention to just one of his later books, which I greatly enjoyed, which was his 1996 text, The Gundas Towards a Reconstruction of the Calcutta Underworld, which, working from official police records and other sources, stimulated an entire genre of academic true crime studies on South Asia that continues strong to this day. And I'll just mention the former student of Park Chil, who's now at Stanford, who was greatly inspired to do his PhD research at Cambridge based on your work in that book, and of course, Raj Chandavakar, who also was greatly influenced by you. Now, Professor Das has held many visiting fellowships and distinguished professorships that are too numerous to list in their entirety, but I will do so anyway, but not in their entirety, but I'll list a few, including at the University of Melbourne, Hull University, the British Academy, La Maison des Sciences de l'Homme, the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and Oxford Brookes University. And he has also recently been elected a fellow of this distinguished society. So we're happy to welcome him here to join our fellowship and our company. And we really look forward to interchanges and exchanges with you on a regular basis from here going forward. Professor Das has also served on numerous public policy committees concerned with higher education in India, such as the University Grants Commission and the Indian Council of Historical Research. He was vice chairman of the Board of Trustees of the Indian Museum in Calcutta. He's been a member of the executive committee of the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library in New Delhi, and several other Indian research funding bodies. He's also a member of the Higher Education Council of West Bengal. Now, the title of Professor Das's lecture today is Revisiting the Nehru Years, 1947 to 64, which reassesses an era that has occupied Professor Das off and on for the last quarter century or so. So I welcome Professor Das to take the floor, and let's please welcome him.
Thank you very much. Today I am before time. You remember when I went to Cambridge in 1994 and you were presiding over the session, I was quite late and I have to apologize for that. But today I made a point that I would be before time. Well, could I say a very big thank you to Royal Asiatic Society for enabling me to be here. And also I express my sincere gratitude to the Royal Asiatic Society for electing me as a fellow. And this is for the first time that I am presenting my paper in Royal Asiatic Society, and that too after being elected a fellow. Thank you very much indeed. It is indeed a privilege to speak in the presence of Professor Peter Robb and Professor David Taylor, who had been sources of my inspiration, encouragement, and sustenance during my Oxford days when I completed my thesis. Peter, thank you very much for always supporting me. David, always supporting me. Thank you very much. It is also a pleasure to have in the audience John, who is the Pro-Vice Chancellor of Bath Spa University, John Stratham. And I had the pleasure of visiting Bath Spa University 3 days back, and presenter shared my views on the changing paradigm of the Indian higher education system. Thank you, John, for coming. Well, why did I choose Nehru? Nehru has always been an enigmatic figure, but as you know, in recent times, there has been a revived interest in Jawaharlal Nehru for reasons I won't explicate right now. And I thought that I should also jump into the wagon and try to establish myself in the new discourses that are coming up about Nehru. And I thought, what could be the best place? What could be the place other than Royal Asiatic Society where I could try out my arguments? And if I'm successful, I try to work along this line to produce a paper. Let me start with some quotes on Jawaharlal Nehru from eminent figures. The first is from Sarvapalli Radhakrishnan, the second president of India, whom we call the philosopher president. This is what he said. I quote, "As a fighter for freedom, he was illustrious. As a maker of modern India, his services were unparalleled. It will be difficult to reconcile ourselves to the image of India without Nehru's active and all-pervasive leadership." Unquote. What did Martin Luther King say about Nehru? I quote, "In all struggles of mankind to rise to a true state of civilization, the towering figure of Nehru sits unseen but felt at all council levels." Unquote. Karl Buck, what was said about Nehru? "There are few people to each century of human life upon this earth who affects the lives of all of us. Such a one was Jawaharlal Nehru." Unquote. After reading Nehru's autobiography, none other than Rabindranath Tagore wrote in 1936, and I quote, "Through all its details, there runs a deep current of humanity, which overpasses the tangles of facts and leads us to the person who is greater than his deeds and truer than his surroundings." Unquote. Lord Mountbatten, the last Viceroy of India, admitted, I quote, "While Nehru and I did not always see eye to eye on every issue, I admired his principled stand and his unwavering dedication to the idea of a united and progressive India." Unquote. Not surprisingly, Jawaharlal Nehru, who uninterruptedly served the world's largest democracy for 17 years as its first prime minister and remained a towering figure in global politics, have attracted the attention of historians and other social scientists. Most of them, however, reflect upon, in one way or other, Nehru's primacy role in initiating the process of making India what is called a modern centrist state, and as well as making India a voice of the global South, a spirit strongly invoked by the present Indian government too. However, we do have critics of Nehru, and they come from two extremes. A, those condemning Nehru for being pseudo-secular and pseudo-socialist, failing in governance, which left much of his vision unfulfilled. And B, communist commentators like Zhukov and Dyakov, who would regard Nehru as a representative of the reformist and class collaborationist trend within India and that of pro-London and pro-Washington force in world affairs. Clearly, time is right for an assessment of Nehru in Indian politics, which should attempt to chart a path beyond the received wisdom. To begin, it is far desirable to commence where the standard biographies end, rather than develop a discourse that revolves around the personality of Nehru. I have taken as an alternative entry point for the present exercise the process of nation building in India, with which Nehru, more than anyone else, was deeply involved. This brings me to the first section, which is entitled Nehru and the Nation Building in India. Most third world countries or most third world states are artificial creations of the departing European powers. Consequently, in such successor states, which were inevitably pluralist states, there did not necessarily occur what I call a convergence between the state and the nation. The territorial frontiers of these new states were not usually in consonance with ethnic, historical, or at times geographical legacies. In such circumstances, the ruling regimes of such states had to undertake what has come to be known as a nation building process. This was also seen in India, and in this process, Nehru occupies a seminal position. Throughout the anti-colonial movement, Jawaharlal symbolized the left and secular force within mainstream nationalism. And it was he who declared to the world India's emergence as a free nation through his famous Tryst Within Destiny speech. But Nehruvian polity, the post-1947 Nehruvian polity, also witnessed certain distortions in India's nation-building process. And much of the contemporary dichotomies in Indian polity today can be found rooted in these distortions. It is important to highlight these facets of Nehruism, but I hope that my presentation today did not be confused either with a conservative critique or with a left radical critique of Nehruism. Instead, my submission rests on the premise that Nehru could not become as progressive or as socialist as he could have been or wanted to be. Instead, there were significant gaps between what Nehru preached and what constituted the ground reality. To explicate my hypothesis, I take Bhikkhu Parekh's crucial article on Nehru and the national philosophy of India as an entry point to identify the following constituent elements in Nehru's nation-building project. A, national unity. B, parliamentary democracy. C, socialism, secularism, scientific temper and industrialization. And D, non-alignment. I propose to explicate the gap between theory and praxis in Nehruvian politics in these realms. To take up national unity. Jawaharlal Nehru considered national unity as the essence of national independence. He disapproved of regional, local, and primordial loyalties, visualizing the Indian state as, I quote, a rational and secular institution based on a shared perception of common interests, unquote. However, as events turned out, Nehru's idealized vision of national unity increasingly partook the feature of national integration imposed from the top. What followed was a process of pan-Indianism, often by alienating local and regional identities. Despite his initial reservations about linguistic reorganization of federal units, Nehru ultimately reconciled himself with this idea. Scholars like Bettelheim had shown how India's post-independence administrative structure was renewed without being remodeled, thus retaining many of the colonial system's imperfections. Hamza Alavi demonstrates that, like other post-colonial regimes, the Indian state was overdeveloped, and the post-independent Congress government unfortunately preferred not to develop an alternative state structure, but maintain the colonial bureaucratic steel frame. The element of continuity between colonial and immediate post-colonial regime in India became particularly evident in a shift of the Congress party's relationship with the police and military from ostensible antagonism until 1947 to increasing interdependence during the post-colonial period. Between 1949 and 1950, Nehru's government used about 12,000 armed police personnel to curb the Telangana peasant uprising. In the first decade of independence, as many as 800 recorded deaths resulted directly from police firings. The police expenditure of Indian government increased from rupees 9 million in 1951-52 to rupees 800 million in 1970-71. The army assisted civil authorities to restore order on 476 occasions between 1947 and 1970, and 350 times between 1980 and 1983. But what was the historical context of this element of continuity between the departing British regime and the new regime under Nehru? I find this context in the working of the Congress provincial ministries in the immediate aftermath of the 1936 elections. Recent studies have demonstrated that the Congress election machinery set up to contest the 1936 legislative elections had a distinct conservative edge. Candidates were generally selected from local businessmen, contractors, and landlords who could not only take care of their own campaigns, but also replenish the party's exchequer. And it was this section inside the party which claimed political power following the 1936 provincial elections in 9 out of the 11 provinces in India. The rightist orientation of the 1937 Congress ministries was reflected in the similarities between their style of functioning and that of the preceding British officers. Several members of the Indian civil service noted with relief that the fire-eating agitators had become responsible ministers. I have an interesting quote from C.H. Masterman, then a secretary in the Madras Secretariat, and he was referring to his conversations with the then Chief Minister of Madras, C. Rajagopalachari, and this is what he said. Rajaji told me once that he had much greater confidence in the judgment of his British secretaries than in his Indian colleagues, unquote. This aspect of continuity in the style of governance between the provincial Congress ministries and the British imperial approach was evident in reactions to popular protest politics. By December 1937, the Congress governments were faced with a dilemma. While the peasant organizations, the Kishan Sabhas, and the trade unions, enthused by the formation of popular regimes, pressed for fundamental agrarian and labor reforms, the Congress tended to back both the landlords and the rising Indian bourgeoisie. Many biographers of Nehru reveal that inside the Congress, Jawaharlal privately expressed his unhappiness at the way the Congress government dealt with popular protest. On 28 April 1938, he wrote to Gandhi, I quote, "I feel strongly that the Congress ministries are adapting themselves far too much to the older and trying to justify it," unquote. Such confessions, I argue, leave little institutional impact on the party, since Jawaharlal and his group refused to make public their critique of the Congress governments on the pretext, I quote, "we cannot agitate against ourselves," unquote. In fact, the right within the Congress gleefully noted in 1938, I quote, "Jawaharlalji has been veering around to our view, and the differences which used to be so marked between his viewpoint and ours on many points is less prominent today," unquote. None than Gandhiji assured Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel as early as 1934, and I quote, "Jawaharlal's explosion is not as frightening as it seems from the flames. He had a right to be let off, which he has exercised. I think he has calmed down now," unquote. The stage, I argue, was thus set immediately after the formation of 1937 provincial ministries and the working of the Congress ministries in the way that I have mentioned, was thus being set for Nehru to become what I call the epitomical figure, providing a centrist leadership to a right-dominated post-independent Indian National Congress. The first manifestation of this was an adverse relationship that developed between the government led by Nehru and the Congress party immediately after independence. While Jawaharlal had a viceregal understanding of the coordinating and leadership role of a prime minister in a cabinet form of government, his own party's president, Acharya J.B. Kripalani, demanded all important pronouncements by Congress members of the ministry should receive prior ratification by the Congress president and the working committee. This differential perception presaged Kripalani's resignation from the Congress presidency in November 1947. In a moving speech, Kripalani emphasized, I quote, "It is the party from which the government of the day derives its power. Any action which weakens the organization of the party or lowers its prestige in the eyes of the people must sooner or later undermine the position of the government," unquote. Judged in historical hindsight, the exit of Kripalani from the Congress presidency was a foretaste for the future. His two immediate successors, Rajendra Prasad and Pattabhi Sitaramaiah, accepted the restricted role of the party. It is true there was a bid to reclaim supremacy of the organizational wing of the Congress party in August 1950, when P.N. Tandon won the presidential election despite Nehru's covert opposition. However, Nehru fomented a crisis by resigning from the working committee on the pretext that Tandon had alienated nationalist Muslims. The consequence that followed was preordained. Tandon's forced resignation and his replacement by Nehru himself in September 1951. This episode virtually ended the party government struggle and confirmed the primacy of the Prime Minister in the Indian polity. Henceforth, Jawaharlal saw to it that each of the Congress presidents after 1954 belonged to the secondary generation of the congressmen who were not yet distinguished enough to question the Prime Minister. Many commentators, including Professor Judith Brown, referred to Nehru's conscious efforts to establish his authority within the Congress in the context of what she calls an ideological need to counteract conservative thinking within the party. I would, however, submit that we need not discount Nehru's determination to imprint his personal stamp on the Congress party. Interestingly enough, during the entire period of Congress party government conflict, a contradiction between theory and practice was clearly manifest in Nehru's postures. Jawaharlal had agreed in principle that the high offices of Prime Minister and Congress President should not be held by the same person. But when he was offered the Congress presidency once in 1951 and again in 1953, he accepted it on the grounds, I quote, of having no alternative. The same lesson was driven home when Indira Gandhi was unanimously elected the Congress president in 1959. Nehru reportedly initially expressed surprise at the idea, remarking, I quote, "It is not a good thing for my daughter to come in as Congress president when I am prime minister," unquote. Yet he never vetoed the proposal, knowing full well that none could be chosen as the Congress president without his explicit concurrence. Seeds of what later has come to be known as dynastic democracy had thus been sown, although in a 1961 interview, Jawaharlal had specifically opposed dynastic democracy. It needs, however, to be stressed that this cleavage between the ruling party and the government can be found in the case of most of the political parties in the third world, which assumed power following a process of decolonization where political and social revolutions were not coterminous. Sukarno of Indonesia, Nasser of Egypt, Kenyatta of Kenya, and Nkrumah of Ghana all sought centralization of personal authority, causing erosion of the efficacy of the respective political parties. India was no exception. This brings me to parliamentary democracy. For Jawaharlal, parliamentary democracy was indispensable for India's survival. Going against some of his compatriots, Jawaharlal stood steadfast for universal adult suffrage in the Constituent Assembly. It was certainly credible that the first general election of 1951-52, shortly after India won independence, was successfully organized with about 176 million electorate and 132,560 polling stations. History shows how the Indian electorate has demonstrated its political adroitness, bringing down ruling regimes both at the center and the province on a number of occasions. Jawaharlal also ensured safeguards for minorities in the country's constitution. And he also introduced, as we know, the three-tier Panchayati Raj and community development projects through which was envisaged the devaluation of power to the grassroots and empowerment of villagers. But as I see it, the political system that developed under Nehru had a particular duality. On the one hand, the country imbibed one of the world's broadest spectrum of political formations. On the other hand, the establishment of Congress hegemony resulted in a one-party political world. The political opposition to the Congress failed to present a united national front against Nehru, thus enabling the Congress to corner 60 to 80% of the parliamentary seats without winning 50% of the votes cast. Nehru's contemporary critics even referred to the use of money power in parliamentary elections to a wide violation of norms of maximum expenditure per constituency. The Congress dominance, I argue, thus came to coexist with competition, but without a trace of alteration. In fact, Nehru's 1953 election slogan of "the Congress is the country" and the country is the Congress, was sought to be imparted as a national political spirit. Events also proved that Nehru was comfortable with political opposition so long as it remained diffused and articulated within the orbit of the Congress system. Non-pliable provincial regimes thus fell victims to the hegemonic drive of the Nehruvian Congress Party. Between 1952 and 1954, president's rule, the central rule, was imposed on the provinces at least 6 times, either due to pressures from within the Congress Party or to ensure Congress dominance in the regions. The unseating in 1959 of the country's first democratically elected communist government in Kerala particularly evoked strong criticism, especially when the Congress, then led by Indira Gandhi, aligned with the local Muslim League to confront the communists. Jawaharlal's government itself enacted the Preventive Detention Act, authorizing arrest and detention without trial, which smacked of British Raj's infamous 1919 Rowlatt Act and invited opposition even from Congress stalwarts like J.B. Kripalani. The Congress system, as the famous political scientist Rajni Kothari called it, that developed during the Nehru regime thus resulted in a centrist bias for Indian Federation. I argue political, administrative, and financial centralization under the Congress guidance became the hallmark of the Indian polity. Big business, urban professionals, and bureaucracy, civil and military, provided the main social force behind this centralized political structure. Undoubtedly, such unitary features bred corrosive tensions. Regional deprivations caused centrifugal tendencies, their outbursts often taking the form of sectarian violence and political anomie, which tended to undermine the very basis of national unity that centralization was supposed to accomplish. Assam was rocked in May 1961 by the Assamese Bengali language issue. The erstwhile Andhra was afflicted by a strong movement for a Telugu-speaking state. In the Punjab, there was a demand for a Punjabi-speaking state. Anti-Hindu agitation rocked Madras. And again, it was during the Nehru regime that Naga separatist politics first made its headway in Northeast India. These waves of discontent made Nehru to observe, I quote, "One might almost think that we were on the verge of civil war in some parts of India," unquote. Nehruvian India also witnessed rising cases of corruption among public officials, from 551 in 1956 to 1,127 in 1961. Instances of the country's finance minister and the defense minister resigning due to financial impropriety is well known. There have been also cases of some ministers at the state level who had to resign because of financial impropriety. Although Nehru's personal integrity was above board, but instances of corruption among his close circles indicated that his loyalty exceeded his judgment. As Rajkumar Amrit Kaur, one-time Nehru's cabinet colleague, confessed, I quote, "Nehru is not a good judge of character and is therefore easily deceived," unquote. Social scientists have pondered over possible reasons behind the ability of the Congress under Nehru to establish its hegemony over India's political space. Some have argued that social complexities and ambiguities prevented the growth of sufficient class polarizations and other contradictions that could fracture the all-embracing alliance of interests represented in the Congress party. Others connect the Congress success to its reliance on the spirit of conciliation. But I would argue that the most plausible clue to the strength of Nehruvian Congress probably lay in its management skill, its ability to co-opt discontented social groups through the apparatus of democratic rights and display of concern for minorities and backward communities. This brings me to the section on socialism, secularism, and scientific spirit in Nehruvian discourse. Nehru found in socialism the panacea for India's social and economic distress. As late as 14 July 1951, at the Bangalore session of the All India Congress, Nehru categorically stated, I quote, "Laissez-faire is almost a dodo. You know, dodo is an extinct bird. So he who thinks in terms of laissez-faire lives in the past, which has no meaning today, certainly in India," unquote. But what was the ground reality? One finds a disconnect between Nehru's words and actuality. Despite his theoretical commitment to socialism, Jawaharlal, thanks to pressures from within the Congress, opted for the Industrial Policy Resolution of 1956 that prescribed a socialistic and not a socialist pattern of society. The solution was found in 5-year plans and a mixed economy. But what actually followed was a move to a state capitalism with considerable participation by the private sector. According to one study, at the close of the third plan, the last plan under Nehru, about 9/10 of India's total domestic product came from the private sector, while the public sector share increased by only 4% in the first 15 years of India's independence. The few top business houses with a strong communal and regional character, 20 according to one estimate, 75 according to another estimate, retained a controlling voice in the economy. Nehru himself went out of the way to convince the country's industrialists that they need not be afraid of socialism and urged them to be a part of the state plan. Pointing to the growing importance of private sector in Nehruvian economy, the Congress socialist leader Jayaprakash Narayan bluntly reminded Nehru, I quote, "You want to go to a socialism, but you want the capitalists to help you in that. You want to build socialism with the help of capitalism," unquote. Yet another perceptible pro-Congress commentator, D.R. Gadgil, noted in a 1962 address, I quote, "The ugly businessman was a major character on the Indian scene, making large profits, promoting corruption, securing the support of officials, and manipulating the administrative machinery," unquote. Shortly before independence, none other than Gandhiji himself made the prophetic remark when he wrote to Nehru, I quote, "You have no uncertainty about the science of socialism, but you do not know in full how you will apply it when you have the power," unquote. Significantly enough, the state capitalism as it developed in India received the tacit approval of leading Indian industrialists. In 1956, Birla is on record, the famous Indian capitalist G.D. Birla is on record as having expressed his agreement with Congress socialist ideals. 6 years later, and 2 years before Jawaharlal's death, Tulsidas Kilachand, the spokesperson of the Indian bourgeoisie, more confidently announced, and I quote, "The business community is in complete agreement with the socialistic objectives of the government, and there are no two opinions on that score. There is no fundamental or ideological difference between the business community and the government," unquote. Even the share of foreign private companies in terms of gross profits in the Indian corporate sector increased during the Nehruvian period from 29.8% in 1959-60 to 33% in 1962-63. In the rural sector too, Nehru privately admitted that some of his basic social engineering schemes, like land reforms, did not significantly take off the ground. In a famous interview to an American magazine, Nehru himself admitted the resilience of the caste prejudice. Even the otherwise pro-Nehru biographer Sarvapalli Gopal admitted, I quote, "The planned development under Nehru's regime did not pave the way for socialism, but promoted capitalist enterprise in both industry and agriculture," unquote. Professor Sarvapalli Gopal goes to the extent of admitting that by the end of the day, I quote, "terms like capitalism and socialism had for Nehru lost their ideological edge," unquote. Recent studies have also forcefully demonstrated that the growth trajectory developed in the Nehruvian state could not be sustained. This is evident from 2 consecutive bad harvests in mid-1960s, a resulting balance of payment crisis that caused devaluation of Indian rupee. The pace of India's industrialization too could not match the rate of industrial growth experienced in many countries which were also latecomers in the field of industrialization. Thus, by the 1980s, while India's industrial growth accounted for only 26% of the GDP, the ratio for Brazil was 45%, for China 43%, for Indonesia 36%, for South Korea and Malaysia 39%, and for Thailand 32%. At the end of the third five-year plan, the last to be formulated before Jawaharlal's death, unemployment figures touched 12 million. Jawaharlal's ideological commitment to secularism and communal harmony was always strong. In his letter to chief ministers of 5th February 1948, Nehru asserted, I quote, "No political religious organizations, or rather no organization confined to a particular religious group and aiming at political ends should be allowed to function," unquote. Yet, Jawaharlal could not push through his secular agenda as strongly as you would have perhaps liked to do. For instance, he failed to evolve a uniform civil code. Major festivals of all religions remained designated as public holidays. Banaras Hindu University and Aligarh Muslim University were allowed to retain distinct religious identities. Major communal outbreaks rocked Nehruvian India, 1948 at Godhra, 1961 at Jabalpur, and in 1964 at Rourkela and Calcutta, which posed a serious threat to the secular fabric of the Indian polity. On the night of 22-23 December 1949, was suddenly discovered images of Hindu deities in the Babri Mosque at Ajodhya, which presaged the subsequent Babri Mosque controversy. Studies have shown how within the Congress, many congressmen had links with Hindu nationalism even during the prelude to the partition. In the aftermath of independence, despite Nehru's reservations, President Rajendra Prasad inaugurated the reconstructed Somnath temple, and Congress chief ministers attended religious functions. Distressed by the communal tensions in provinces like Uttar Pradesh, Nehru confided on 17th April 1950, "Indeed, the UP is becoming almost a foreign land to me," unquote. It may also be mentioned that in the matter of rehabilitation of refugees in the aftermath of the partition, Nehru's government adopted a contradictory posture in the two most affected provinces, Bengal and the Punjab, which had severe implications for future regional politics in Bengal and the Punjab. There is reason to argue that Nehru's pursuit of socialistic and secularistic agenda was constrained by a particular method of decision making within the Congress of the time. This was a reliance on consensus, and it held the right to continue with stranglehold on the party, given the fact that there was a 3-to-1 ratio in favor of the conservatives within the Congress Working Committee since the mid-1950s. Besides, a systematic marginalization of dissent within the High Command contributed to the hegemony of the right within the Congress. What followed was what I call a sort of democratic centralism, where the right-wingers could make their weight felt, while the left minority had to be satisfied with concessions. Thus, Nehru's anti-capitalist and anti-landlord stance in his public pronouncements could not be much realized in actual practice. Well aware of his political predicament, Nehru acknowledged in bitter frustration that his politics had become confined to, I quote, "of my class, the bourgeoisie," unquote. Coming to Nehru's passion for science and technology, I need not take your time to cite instances of Nehru's initiation of projects relating to the building of dams, major irrigation works, modern industries, and modern science and technology institutes. In Nehruvian perception, the promotion of science and technology, however, was not merely confined to industrialization, but he also sought to generate what he called a scientific spirit among the rank and file of the country. Significantly, Nehru made it a point to address every session of the Indian Science Congress. Despite all these efforts of promoting a scientific temper, non-scientific and archaic values continued to maintain a stranglehold at the popular level in India. This brings me to the last segment, non-alignment. The other area of nation building where Nehru's contribution stands high is the pursuit of the policy of non-alignment in world politics, a policy which marked a break with Asia's subservience to Europe and the West. The following comment on Nehru's standing in the then world politics is certainly not wide of the mark. I quote, "When Nehru spoke, the world listened with attention. His was a voice speaking not only on behalf of India, but also of the non-aligned world," unquote. Yet, from hindsight, it appears that Nehru's unconscious bid to make India represent the rising Asia sowed the seeds of a future fear amongst many of its neighbors. At the same time, Nehru often unduly placated our neighbors, perhaps driven by his genuine desire for good neighborly relations. He thus recognized Chinese sovereignty over Tibet despite internal resentment. The 1962 Sino-Indian border conflict is widely perceived as a failure of his Ponchil doctrine to cement Sino-Indian cordiality. He chose to stay away from Nepal even when his intervention was invited. He even toyed with an idea of a federation with Pakistan when that country demonstrated all signs of recalcitrance. His reference of the Kashmir issue to the United Nations Organization did not yield his anticipated result. Again, there was Nehru's surprising silence at Britain's racialized war in Malaya. Besides also committed to non-alignment, Nehru, especially in his initial days, faced westward for military and financial cooperation. India remained within the orbit of the Starling system, while the US and the UK continued to be major trading partners in the aftermath of independence. In 1951, while the US accounted for 46.5% of India's imports, the UK share was 20%. Significantly, at the time of Nehru's death, Soviet Union's share of India's imports was merely 10%, and India's exports to the USSR was even smaller. This brings me to the concluding part of my submission. Even the otherwise strongest critics of Nehru's stewardship of independent India admit that the years between 1947 and 1964 were an age of experimentation in India, and Nehru's contribution was phenomenal. In April 1953, Nehru had been confident, and I quote, "I shall not rest content unless every man, woman, and child in the country has a fair deal and has a minimum standard of living. 5 or 6 years is too short a time for judging a nation. Wait for another 10 years, and you will see that our plans will change the entire picture of the country so completely that the world will be amazed," unquote. But when Nehru breathed this last on 27th May 1964, this optimism had proved to be an illusion. Nevertheless, the question remains, why did Nehru fail to realize much of his cherished goals of nation building? Partly this was related to the correlation of forces within the Congress party, which had caused a centrist domination over the most powerful anti-nationalist organization, anti-imperialist organization of the time, a point which I had stressed in my submission. Jawaharlal himself realized his loneliness in this context, admitting in his autobiography, and I quote, "I have been one of a mass, moving with it, swaying it occasionally, being influenced by it, and yet, like the other units, an individual, apart from the others, living my separate life in the heart of the crowd," unquote. In fact, at one point in 1958, Nehru even sought his party's permission to retire from prime ministership, of course, if only temporarily. As anticipated, this offer of resignation found no taker in the Congress. Although contemporary skeptics would contend that Jawaharlal raised this issue to be reassured that he was as indispensable and as much loved as ever. But as Shashi Tharoor, himself a Congress parliamentarian, makes the following interesting point, and I quote, "There is no reason to suppose that his offer of resignation was not genuine, and his acceptance would have set a democratic precedent around the developing world, none of whose first independence leaders had ever resigned voluntarily," unquote. Yet it is plausible to reiterate that the basic inadequacy in Nehruvian style of governance lay not in a faulty vision, but in Nehru's inability to create new institutions, to implement the program of national development and social change. Nehru also himself imbibed a sense of infallibility thanks to the Olympian presence in Indian politics, especially after Vallabhbhai Patel's death, when he progressively turned into a leader without equal and without a rival. More importantly, the dysfunctionality in Nehruvian governance that I have mentioned was linked to what I call a structural factor, connected as it was to what I call an imperfect transfer of power on the 15th of August 1947. What occurred on that day was, to borrow a phrase from Antonio Gramsci, a passive revolution. Passive not because the people were passive, but passive because the political transfer of power was divorced from a socio-economic transformation. There was in August 1947 no telescoping of political and socio-economic revolutions. The social forces which were created in the quest for freedom thus proved to be grossly inadequate and unsuited to the task of qualitatively transforming and developing a large country and the great mass of its population in the way Nehru had envisaged. Nirmal Kumar Bose, a staunch Gandhian, he was the private secretary of Gandhi when Gandhi was in Noakhali. He was later the first scheduled caste commissioner and has written extensively on Gandhi. And in this context, I'd like to quote what Nirmal Kumar Bose said to substantiate this point. This is what Nirmal Kumar Bose noted in late 1950s, and I quote, "By virtue of the circumstances of peaceful transfer of power, the Congress inherited an administrative structure which it tried to use for a new purpose. Its idea became not to disrupt the status quo, but to build up a socialistic pattern of economy on the foundation of the existing order without a violent disturbance. The identification of the Congress with the institutional status quo has created a kind of frustration and even of cynicism amongst those who had made the attainment of political freedom synonymous with the advent of social revolution or moral regeneration." Unquote. 3 years before his death, Nehru himself acknowledged, and I quote, "I failed to change this administration. It is still a colonial administration." Unquote. Let me here quote a pertinent comment of a socialist thinker of Nehru's time, Ashok Mehta, and he notes on this contradiction. I quote, "In the case of leaders of men, there is an angle of refraction between ideas and achievements. In Nehru, the angle has grown with the unfolding of his ideas. In their acceptance, as disenchantment has grown. That is at once the glory and tragedy of Jawaharlal Nehru." Unquote. In this context, perhaps an interesting appraisal comes from the lifelong critique of Nehru's politics. Sri Atal Bihari Vajpayee, initially Jansangh and then BJP leader, who succeeded Jawaharlal Nehru as Prime Minister in 1996. This is what he said upon the death of Nehru. I quote, "A dream has remained half fulfilled, a song has become silent, and a flame has vanished into the unknown. The dream was of a world free of fear and hunger, the song of a great epic resonant with the spirit of the Gita and as flagrant of a rose, the flame of a candle which burnt all night long, showing us the way, the orchestrator of the impossible and inconceivable." Unquote. Sarvapalli Gopal tells us that possibly realizing that Nehru was leaving behind much of his dream unfulfilled, had on his desk the poignant words of Robert Frost. I quote, "The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep and miles to go before I sleep." Unquote. Let me conclude with a quote from Jawaharlal Nehru himself, and I quote, how is a leader of men to function? If he is leader, he must lead and not merely follow the dictates of the crowd. If he acts singly according to his own lights, he cuts himself down to the same level of understanding as others. Then he has lowered himself, been untrue to his own ideal, and compromised that truth. And once such compromises begin, there is no end to them, and the path is slippery. What then is he to do? He must succeed in making others perceive the truth also." Unquote. I leave it to the distinguished House to judge if in this light Nehru fulfilled his vision and fulfilled the criteria of a leader of modern India. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Professor Das, for such a wide-ranging talk this evening, which mines the seam between Nehru's words and his deeds. And what I really enjoyed about your talk is the way you put those dilemmas within a wider context, both of what had come before in terms of the legacy of the British Empire, with which he had to deal with some degree of success or not, as you've shown, but also with the reality of what existed on the ground amongst the population of India, with all its different interest groups and various agendas, different modes of organization, which did not map onto a single overarching scheme. And so you presented a very rich and detailed set of circumstances which led to the unresolved dilemmas that Nehru faced. one of the things that struck me, I'm just going to play a little bit of a devil's advocate because I'm going to ask a question which I don't believe myself. But you present Nehru as, you took Nehru's words at his word, and that you presented those as what he truly wanted. And the circumstances were things that were impediments to his achieving those things. And I wonder if he was skillful in any ways in using those impediments to achieve what he actually did achieve. And one of the things that he achieved was which you detailed fantastically, was despite his rhetoric of not socialism, but I forget the term, socialistic, yes. But he was, but was that an actual aim, or was he something who was, he's been, what I have in the back of my mind is the accusation which is being leveled to him in recent years about his distinct elitist propensities in terms of how he drew on support, the type of support and the type of leadership within the Congress Party that he favored, and so I'm wondering within the rhetoric of socialism, whether he was using that as a way of hiding a much stronger elitist vision of India, which he was building through the high degree of centralization that he was able to accomplish within certain limits. And so the question I'm posing is, why do you feel justified in taking Nehru at his own word as to what he wanted to do, and as opposed to seeing what he accomplished as what he wanted to accomplish? So I'd be interested. You'll have to respond to the mic. So if you yeah. So that's my question is, and then we'll open to the floor.
Well, thank you. I mean, this is one of the predicaments of writing the biography of a person. Whether it's Nehru, whether it's Oscar Wilde, whether it's any Shakespeare, anybody, you have to take as an entry point. And the entry point of in doing such a work is to start with what your subject says. But what I've tried to show, there was a gross difference between what he said and what was the ground reality. I'd also tried to show that he perhaps believed in what he said. I mean, I do not think a person of Nehru's stature would not be saying in so many ways, in so many words, things we did not believe. But I think Nehru has a tragic personality because he could not, as I said, build up the social forces and political forces that were necessary for radical transformation that he wanted India to undergo. And second, he could not challenge the centrist and rightist domination within the Congress Party. And as a result, what had happened, there was a gross difference between what he said and what was the ground reality. My argument in choosing this topic is that usually if you look at the works of Nehru, either there's hagiography or there's a strong critique. But I think we need to take a middle ground to place Nehru in the proper context. And the proper context for me is a nation building process.
Okay, we can take some questions from the floor. Peter, you're first up.
I make a confession. I'm the Indian historian because I read Nehru's biography. Now I don't have worked on it. Didn't have front. I'm struck by what you you said at the outset, that continuity seems to be extraordinary. Number of parallels. Going well. Talk about religious days we celebrated by a second. Well, the East India Company did that in 1770. But it's something about how you have worked within a system. And the case of many of the other people, I said, oh yes. Industrialization and science. Okay, look at the problems of many sorts they're repeated. And it's curious that it's not curious. Is what to expect. Conflict, highly developed, sophisticated society, you come into rule. You cannot just pick your fingers. Blimey, they can't pick their fingers. Relatively smaller population. They certainly couldn't pick it. It's true of the British. Think about communal descent. In the 20th century, there were lots of conservative Brits who were saying, oh, you can't give independence. They can't even agree amongst themselves. Well, it was true in a sense. And they, you might say, the great success of Nehru was to overcome that. The place is still together. So I think that the interesting thing about his personality, his failures, with a very valid subject. But what interests me is what were his options? What was the context? We talked about narrow context, the makeup of Congress. He was in hot to all sorts of other people. He was in hot to ideas about what the state should be doing. Well, which were important. There was all of that which was behind him. But I wonder, when you look at it, the British colonial regime was doing this in the 18th century, having a sense of problem. But continuity might be the interest. It would be nice to know what you think about not just the political option, but whether or not it was possible for anyone to come in a brief period to give the terms, features, which I may say, since more than there were there. He believed in law. He believed in parliamentary constitution, and he did his best to persuade people. Worked on UP and said, it's interesting what they were trying to do was to get the Congress politician who just won elections to behave like government. The president, he just wrote your face. No, come on. It's supposed to be ruling that country. And that was quite imaginative. It shows the sort of enormity of the problem. And it's an enormity which, as I suggest, was being faced one way or another. Throughout history. So I would be interested to know what you think about had he been actually brilliant and more effective, could he have actually somehow, could anyone actually have overcome the problem?
Well, that's certainly a very interesting question, and in the spirit of Peter Rao.
Oh, by the way, I should have said thank you.
Peter, what I would like to say is, number one, I do not believe in a theory where in history there is a sudden change. There has to be elements of continuity and discontinuity. But in the case of Nehru, if you go to the standard literature, when we were students, we were taught, we were given the wisdom that Nehru introduced a distinct break in terms of nation building. and all those things, socialism, secularism, scientific development, blah, 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 had actually made what India is today. My argument would be, yes, he believed in all these things. But in the context of what was happening, A, in the organizational structure, A, what was happening outside, he could not carry forward his ideas. And the result is the sort of idealized picture that we got about Nehru in our younger days, that should be rectified, and he should be placed in a proper context, not denigrating him, but to place him in the context and outline the limitations of his work, which was tremendous indeed. I'm not belittling it, but what I'm trying to rectify is the received wisdom of a completely hagiographic positive feature of Nehru. That was my point. Yes.
Yeah, again, thank you
Yeah,
for
that's okay.
such an interesting
Yeah.
kind of overview, I suppose. And what, some of the points that you were making reminded me of another RAS fellows, Taylor Sherman.
Oh, yes, yes. I borrowed quite a lot from his book. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I've got
It's-
Nehru's India,
Yeah.
A History in 7 Myths.
Yes, yes, yes.
I suppose,
Hmm.
readiness or willingness to kind of go back and
Hmm.
think again about what had been
Mm.
achieved, what could
Yeah,
be achieved.
yeah.
I just wonder, through all your work that you've done on Nehru, whether you picked up any sense in which he even recognized in himself that he was making myths. That makes sense.
Yeah.
I just wonder what, because you touched a little bit on his regret at a certain point, frustration at another time, you know, over that period of, is it 17 years? I just wondered if, through the readings that you've done, whether you get any sense of that in his own thinking.
Well, I would say at the end of the day, he was a disappointed person. And that comes out from his own writings, that comes out from the various interviews that he gave shortly before his death. That comes out in that book also. But what I think, there's a qualitative difference between that book and my presentation. I do not want to present Nehru in a negative light. There have been some instances nowadays to present Nehru in a negative light. But what I would like to do is to place Nehru in the proper historical context. And for example, all the major dichotomies within the Congress and nation building, which I tried to argue, can be traced back to the 1936-37 provincial ministries. Vinita Damodaran had done a wonderful work so far as Bihar is concerned. And if we work on similar lines in other 9 provinces, 9 out of the 11 provinces where the Congress gained the majority, we find the same thing. So the rupture had already started then. And we cannot ignore that particular macro thing. But sometimes what happens when Nehru is projected in a critical light, that is forgotten. That is where I want to make an intervention. We need not be hagiographic, but we need not be also unnecessarily negative in assessing Nehru. Every man has his faults. But in the case of Nehru, I think his seminal contribution was towards nation building. There were a lot of negative features, there were a lot of discrepancies, which the results of which we are facing today. That also needs to be addressed. That is my only point.
So in a sense, what you're saying is, first and foremost, we have to see him as a man of his time.
Exactly,
Understand
exactly,
that time.
exactly, exactly,
Challenges.
exactly. It's a relationship between the individual and society, which needs to be taken on board, not view individual as an individual.
Disrupting system with us. I don't think actually no. Lord, accommodated many. So yes. Well, without that. I mean, yeah, as we-
Well, David, I think if I could react in this way, the basic difference between a political scientist and historian is that historian doesn't believe in counterfactuality. And the plus point of a political scientist is that you go beyond what the historians find out and do counterfactuality. But what I would say that if you imagine a situation where Nehru was not there, you are perfect. It could either been gone the Pakistan way, or it would have gone in a dimension of the Chinese way. None of this happened. But that again, I think, was not due exactly only for Nehru. If you compare the Muslim League political movement and the Congress political movement, there were qualitative difference between the two. And that sort of democratic element within the Congress movement has to be given due recognition. I mean, Gandhi, you might criticize in different ways. But the greatest contribution of Gandhi, I think, is to develop Congress as a platform where all sorts of people from various castes, creed, with different mentalities with one common thing, fight British imperialism could be brought together. That did not happen in the Muslim League. So that particular legacy that Nehru inherited made it absolutely clear that we could have gone neither the Pakistan way nor the Chinese way. But as I said, you are better in counterfactual propositions rather than me. But that's an important question, and perhaps if I write something, I would end with that.
Maddie, do we have any questions from online?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, we just have two questions. One is from Sanjukta Ghosh, and she asks, thank you for your talk. Did Nehru fail to align with philanthropic businesses at the time?
Could you repeat that, the question again?
Sure.
Matt?
Did Nehru fail to align with philanthropic businesses at the time?
With businesses.
Phil-
Philanthropy. Oh, I'm not sure about that. I've not looked into it, but my guess would be that Nehru had very strong connections with philanthropic organizations, and that was quite normal during that time. But frankly, I haven't looked at it in that way.
Okay, and the last one, this is maybe a bit general, but the general question is, how do you see Nehru's ideology in current Indian perspective?
Well, that's a very relevant topic. I think Nehru's ideology does have contemporary relevance, but again, I think we need to also place Nehru's ideas in the changing context of the time. What was perhaps completely relevant in Nehruvian time might not be completely relevant in today's time. Things change, history changes, people's attitude changes, but I still believe that's why parliamentary democracy is concerned. His ideas on socialism, his ideas on secularism, his ideas on parliamentary democracy, national unity are still relevant, but perhaps not, they would not be as relevant in the same way as it was perhaps between 1947 and 1964. But if we have to build up a democratic, socialist, secularist India, we cannot ignore Nehru.
Great. Well, thank you very much for the absolutely fascinating talk and stimulating discussion afterwards. Come and join us in a glass of wine. And but thank you very much.